dann fangen wir an. Nach der Mittagspause ist immer
So let's start. After the lunch break, it's always a difficult moment, but we'll probably handle that well. Warm welcome to everybody to the next session. My name is Mareike Haase. I'm working in Brot für die Welt for the international health politics, and I'm co-moderating the session with my colleague Ferenc.
Hello everyone from my side as well. Nice to be here today. My name is Ferenc Bagyinszky. I am executive coordinator of AIDS Action Europe, one of the co-organizers of this conference. And I am very happy to co-facilitate this session with Mareike. And I would also like to introduce a very old friend and longtime comrade in the fight against HIV and AIDS, Jeffrey Akaba, Jeff, who is in the background working with us, taking notes, and then after the event, he's going to provide a piece of writing on this session. Back to you, Mareike.
Vielen Dank, Ferenc. Vielen Dank, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. As you noticed, the co-moderation will be bilingual in German and English, because also in the discussion we will probably also have German-speaking participants, so some technical points up front. There is some simultaneous interpretation. You can find a little globe on the bottom of your screen where you can choose the language you would like to listen to. And I'll be speaking German. Ferenc will speaking English. And maybe just some information, you can always ask questions. Always please use on Zoom the F&A section, which we will incorporate in the course of the session into our discussion and debates. So we're in the session now. Global health architecture is changing. Where are the champions? And so we'll have a look on the role of Germany, of course, that's for sure. What has been changing? We're still living in the middle of the global pandemic, the corona pandemic, and we see that a series of institutional changes are taking place over the next years, which will have an influence on global health. Existing structures as the Global Fund, for example, but also WHO, will partly be questioned in their role. Maybe there are restructurings necessary towards to other capacities in vision of future pandemics. There are new institutions which have been created, like Act A, for example, but also there is they talk about a pandemic fund. So in the next months, it will be probably about to reposition global orientation, global health politics. On one hand, to have the look on this pandemic and maybe future upcoming pandemics, but on the other side also to keep in vision the actual needs of health services and health support. We've heard already it's about human right-based, human-centered global politics which need to be implemented, not to leave behind, which have been marginalized already in the past. It's about financing of global health with all the new institutions which will be created, maybe. The financial needs to be modified without getting into competition between these different organizations, and the interaction, of course, in global health needs to be improved between existing and future organizations, but also what we've discussed already, the role of civil society needs to be strengthened. The local communities, civil society actors should be better involved and use their expertise, which is abundant in this context. So in the next 1.5 hours, we're going to talk about these new challenges and new changes which are not so clear. Partly, maybe we can shed some light into the dark. We will want to have a look into the role of Germany as a global health champion. And therefore, in the first part of this session, we will listen to two presentations by Christoph, Benn and Sasha Volgina, and in the second part we will get into a discussion with Ms. Baehrens, Ms. Pickel and Mr. Zubeil. And of course we will also involve Christoph and Sasha. And just to remind you, you can always ask questions. Please use the F&A section, which we'll keep controlled, and we will bring in your questions. So I hand over to the first presentation of Christoph Benn. Christoph, you are doctor yourself, medical doctor yourself. You're at the Joep Lange Institute in Amsterdam now, but actually you are in Geneva, I think. You have been connected with the Global Fund for many years, since its foundation, many years. You worked as the director for external relationships of the Global Fund. So we're looking forward to your presentation, dear Christoph, in terms of changing health landscape and the expectations on global health champions. Yes, thank you, Mareike. Thank you to all the organizers of this event for inviting me. It's really a very exciting topic, and I'm looking forward to the discussion after my short input. I prepared my input in English, but I could easily switch between these two languages also later on the discussion. But first of all, I'm going to speak English.
This question of changing global health architecture. First of all, I think we have to say that pandemics and epidemics have always been a kind of catalyst for change in the global health architecture and also in other global instruments. And HIV/AIDS, the global response to HIV/AIDS is actually a very good example for that, because in a sense, HIV has been the first big pandemic after the Second World War. But in that case, it took the global community a long time to respond to that and to establish the architecture that we have until today. So AIDS was first described as a new disease in 1981. It took a couple of years for WHO to establish their global program on AIDS. It took 15 years until UNAIDS was created as the joint response of all the UN agencies. And then when the situation was getting really bad in the year 2001, and when AIDS together with tuberculosis and malaria were causing around 6 million deaths per year, by the way, quite similar to the level that we have currently with COVID. That was then the moment when then Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, took the initiative, called for a UN General Assembly special session, and this General Assembly decided that they should add a new funding organization that then became the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. So a long process in the response to AIDS, but with the result of also creating new organizations like UNAIDS and the Global Fund. When the world was shocked by the Ebola epidemic in 3 West African countries in 2014, also then there was the response, oh, we are not well prepared for that. We, for example, should have had a vaccine against Ebola for a long time. And the answer then was that the international community created CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, in 2017, with a mandate to do research and to kind of facilitate research into new pathogens that then became also very critical when the world was hit by the new virus, SARS-CoV-2, just 3 years later. And now with the COVID-19 pandemic, again, we already see changes in the architecture. Mareike, you mentioned Act A, that was the very quick response, if you like, within a few months, not creating a new organization, but to ask the existing organizations to work together in a new way, coordinated by WHO, but then working in the 3 pillars, vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, and the 4th one on health system strengthening. So that was kind of the first reaction to this response, but not yet a new organization. This year, we've had 2 major reports that then actually suggested that the world would need a new funding mechanism to respond to this and future pandemics. There was first the WHO International Panel on Pandemic Preparedness and Response, the IPPR, and then followed by the G20 high-level panel on financing global commons. And both of them actually recommended the creation of a new funding mechanism. But different from 2001, it was not a very kind of broad, response to that. It wasn't that many member states of WHO or the G20 even that commissioned this high-level panel would have come together and said, yes, this is what we are going to do now. In fact, the only head of state who picked that up and who then suggested the creation of a new fund was President Biden of the US, who at the UN General Assembly in September then proposed a new financial intermediary fund for pandemic preparedness and response hosted by the World Bank. However, apart from Norway, no other kind of country, high income or middle or low income country, very publicly supported that. And in the then G20 that happened shortly after that, this new fund was not even mentioned by name in the declaration. So that, in my view, is quite different from the response to other, pandemics and epidemics before. And now we are faced with three key questions, in my view. Do we need a new fund? How should it be structured? And how will it be financed? So first, do we need a new fund? I would say not necessarily, but we clearly need, significantly increased international resources to respond to the current pandemic and to help the world to be better prepared for future pandemics. The Act A has a huge, funding gap that is existing. And we haven't even kind of addressed the kind of need for a fund that addresses the future global health threats. So clearly, funding is much required, urgently required in a sense, but the question whether this has to be done through a kind of new or an existing fund, I think that's an open question, and we probably will hear different opinions of that. I'm more inclined to say that I think, we have an existing architecture that works well. And among the organizations that exist, the Global Fund probably has the best mechanism, if you like, to mobilize and channel relatively quickly and with high accountability this money to countries in need. And it has already shown that in the current pandemic. And all of this under the coordination with WHO as a normative agency, as has happened before. Secondly, so how should such a mechanism, be organized, whether it's using an existing one or a future one? I do think that, even if the consensus was to create a new one, there are a couple of lessons to be learned from 2001, 2002, and from the creation of the Global Fund. Because what you need is legitimacy, you need broad support from a multitude of stakeholders. I think that is absolutely essential these days. As with the Global Fund, following the declaration of the UN General Assembly, there was strong support from many countries at all income levels, the UN, G7, civil society, private sector. And very importantly, then UN Secretary General established a transitional working group that would work on the governance structure and the operating modalities hosted by the European Commission as a neutral kind of partner. And I think something like that would have to happen if the world is seriously considering a funding mechanism for pandemic preparedness and response. And what then became a hallmark of the Global Fund, the strong involvement of civil society and of communities, representing particularly the most vulnerable groups. I think this should be quintessential for any new funding mechanism or for kind of expanded mandate for existing mechanisms. Otherwise, it cannot function well, and it wouldn't have the legitimacy that any new funding mechanism needs. And then finally, the financing. Absolutely, the world needs more funding for ending existing pandemics, such as AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and to address new ones like the COVID-19 and those that we don't even know yet. So this can, again, build on existing mechanisms, but I do also think that we need new principles and new methodologies. Otherwise, we will not be able to finance these global challenges. And I want to quote two quotes from the G20 high-level panel that I think are important in this context. They said, first, nations must commit to a new base of multilateral funding for global health security based on pre-agreed and equitable contributions shared by advanced and developing countries. And secondly, they say that we must recognize above all that international support from pandemic preparedness and response is fundamentally not about aid, but about investment in global public goods from which all countries benefit. So these are already outlining these principles in this kind of influential report. Many, development finance thinkers and experts call exactly what this panel, called for global public investment with the principles that every country contributes, not only the richest ones, but also middle income, even low income countries. Everybody contributes according to their ability. Every country benefits and every country participates in the decision making. I do believe that this is the only way in the future how we can address the main global challenges, not only in health, because we have this parallel challenge of pandemics and climate change, to which the world needs to be better prepared. And we need new ideas, new ways how we can finance that. Finally, to your key question, who are the champions? Well, I think not only we, and I include me as a German, look at Germany and the new government, also because of the G7 presidency next year, but it's also because it's hard to see who else, apart from Germany, hopefully with strong, alliance with the United States, because they already announced this new fund and are known to be engaged in that. These are the two champions that we definitely need. They are absolutely essential, and then they need to bring in many other countries. But I don't see this kind of leadership coming from other countries than Germany and the US right now. And I sincerely hope that the new government will indeed play this role, continue their role in global health, and will then work with many other countries, with civil society, with the private sector to make it happen. But there's hardly any other global challenge and global task that is more important and more urgent than this one. So I stop here and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for your input and insights and starting of the conversation. And before going into the discussion, I would like to give the floor to another old friend and comrade of mine, Sasha Volgina from GNP Plus, the global network of people living with HIV. And we are very much interested in your insights into the issue, into these questions that we have already started discussing. Those who don't know, Sasha is a champion of community leadership. This is what I can tell about her. She is fierce and passionate about the interest of people living with HIV and also who are affected by HIV and AIDS and other diseases. And she's a fighter for human rights, and especially for those who are left behind by the current responses. So, Sasha, the floor is yours. I'm very much interested in your input. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ferenc, and thanks a lot, everyone, for that discussion as well. And thanks a lot, Christoph, for this first part, because, for us as the communities, it's important whether we will have separate mechanisms or we won't have the separate mechanisms. The most important, what we are really confident in is that competition between two pandemics will kill effective response to both. Opposite, the combinations of lessons learned from decades of HIV response and success examples of the joint HIV and COVID response we have from the recent 2 years of trying to cooperate with both epidemics at the same time, will give us the pandemic preparedness and will give us an effective response. Instead of trying to determine which of the pandemics needs support and attention more, we as global communities should focus on most effective measures, which we know work well and support successful approaches. So I think that's the angle we should take when we are thinking about the future. I also wanted to stress that I fully support, that it have to be the governments of the mechanism have to be, have to include civil society and communities, and that's what we've seen during the response. People were heavily involved in response, but they were not so much, involved in the decision making and design of the programs. They're working quite a lot on the ground. So let me focus on the most effective responses measures. So first and critical one, and we have already discussed that in the morning, element of any pandemic response in our understanding is equitable access to medicine, vaccines, and diagnostic for everyone. That will save lives and that will save funds. The vaccine inequalities of today's COVID response echo the treatment inequalities of early AIDS response. We all do remember that quite well. Generic HIV drugs became available only when we demanded them. So we have to be bold in measures we use. Yes, in some cases, voluntary license mechanisms can be used, but they have their own limitations. As a member of the medicine patent pool, I can say, board of the medicine patent pool, I can say that. We also have other mechanisms such as compulsory license, waivers, patent oppositions, which are pushed by communities, and they need to be strengthened. We can't afford to wait for the access for decades once again. Global response in many pandemics have to develop further and invest equally into instruments given by Doha Declaration and fully use them to ensure medicine, vaccines, and diagnostics are affordable. We are calling Global Fund to support treatment access measures because we see in some cases that it feels that that responses to people who are asking for funding for treatment access advocacy is no, usually, because it seems to that medicine patent pool is fulfilling that gap, but that's not true. No, so we think that funding should be strengthened and that we should invest in that kind of advocacy. We also think that German government should support Global Fund in funding treatment advocacy. And we also hope that these programs, I remember myself several years ago back in Ukraine implementing GIZ program for treatment access advocacy, which is not case now, right? It's not in the portfolio. So we hope that these streams of funding also can be reopened and that we can put back treatment access on a radar. So the second very important lessons learned from the both epidemics of the recent 2 years, several measures were pushed by communities and civil society for a long time before COVID, such as several months description of IRBs, switching to online information and service delivery, and scaling up the community responses. But we were hearing excuses that people are not disciplined enough to get several months of IRBs, or that services and information can't be provided by community-led organizations. Well, frankly, only high-skilled medical workers can make that job. Crisis can move things which are not moving for a pretty long period, being honest. All that suddenly finds out to be possible. And let me stop and draw your attention to the community-led response. We communities can really complement traditional health systems. We have heard in the previous sessions how much was done and how resilient our community finds out to be. And we can complement that response in three key roles: providing services, improving trust between health systems and societies, and getting involved in planning and decision making is a key one as well, and ensure accountability. So we have also to be reminded that the successful those who were well resourced, if we look at the examples of the past 2 years, we think that trusting us community is a winning strategy. Community-led organizations manage to respond really in a proper way to the challenges we've got with the COVID in coming into the countries. We have seen the success of the COVID special stream of funding coming from Global Fund to community-led organization. Though we have heard the same excuses previously: weak, not prepared, not well educated. But it finds out not to be the case. We managed to make the job properly. We should take that lesson. Money from Global Fund should and can go directly to the communities and who have been proven during the recent pandemics responses that we are reliable enough. And in conclusion, just wanted to say that more, no less health spending. That's, I also agree with the Christoph pretty much. More, no less health spending is a priority for pandemic preparedness and to take both pandemics, COVID and HIV pandemics, under control. And we don't need to choose between them. And we need to invest and support measures and approach that work effectively. Yeah, let me finish here.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for your input and insight. Always wonderful. And I think we already answered one of the questions of this session: who are the champions? And community leaders are the champions as well. community people who are delivering in case of crisis, regardless of the environment, regardless of the conditions that we are forced to work in. So thank you so much. We heard two different inputs into the same issue, one coming from looking at the current structures and the current challenges and trying to set already some of the principles for the future cooperation in health, not just addressing HIV and AIDS, but other pandemics and the future pandemics that are coming up. And then we could hear some major principles already started set by Sasha, for instance, equitable access and the inclusion of community leadership and community responses. And we all agree we need much more funding, many more champions who will take the leadership in the responses. With this, I would like to hand over to my wonderful co-facilitator, Mareike, who will facilitate the panel discussion, because we have some more people waiting to be listened to.
Vielen Dank, Ferenc.
Thank you so much, Ferenc. Now, I would like to build a bridge to our discussion, to our panel discussion with our different guests. We have Heike Baehrens here, Paul Zubeil, and Birgit Pickel. Maybe I can introduce you first of all. So Heike Baehrens, she is member of the SPD, the Social Democratic parliamentary group, and she worked for the Health Committee of the federal government. And you are also the spokesperson of the Health Committee of the Social Democrats. I would like to continue with Ms. Pickel. You are in charge of the Director for Global Health, Pandemic Prevention, One Health within the ministry, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And then we do have Mr. Zubeil. He is the he is the head of the Department Z2 dealing with Europe and health policies within the Federal Ministry for Health. So we found ourselves in a vacuum because there will be a new government maybe starting to work or taking up work next week. We don't know. We do have a new coalition contract we've received, so we can more or less predict what will happen in the future when it comes to global health. So I think what we have to do is how far we are really able to predict the future and to look in the future. And I would like to start with you, Ms. Baehrens. You can definitely you have the opportunity to refer to what we've just happened, what we've just heard, but I would like to ask the following question. So, Ms. Baehrens, the new federal government will take over office next week, and we've already had the opportunity to have a look at the new coalition contract. And I think there is, on one hand, when it comes to global health, there is a huge a reference made to human rights, to equality, social inclusion, economic inclusion. We've already heard a lot about it today. And this is one side, but on the other side, there is a lack of concrete information on global health, because we are just in the midst of this pandemic, and nevertheless, there has not been a sufficient amount of information regarding equitable or fair access to vaccines, vaccinations in general, etc. So, from your point of view as member of the Committee for Health, so what is your impression in terms of the last 2 years? How did let's say, the point of view when it comes to global health, how did it change, like Christoph Benn said? Do you think this is an opportunity for new things, new ideas, new visions, and in order to really focus on health crises, etc.? Or do you think that there is a danger that you will only refer or focus on pandemics, and that other pandemics such as the HIV, TB, tuberculosis, etc., pandemic will be left behind? Oh, that was a very complex question. Thank you very much for this question. I think we are on the same page, and we know that the pandemic situation due to, or just in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic is paramount. It's everywhere and at a global level because the pandemic is raging in all parts of the world, and we are just in a phases where we're just about to learn how to control, how to manage these developments, and this is definitely requiring a lot of funding, so financial resources, but also standards and norms and policies. And our health system is, of course, very much under pressure. So I think this is dominated, or the debate is dominated by the current health crisis. But regarding my experiences from the last legislative period, where we've had the subcommittee for health that has been created during this time, I think it was really a good idea to have this subcommittee, because here in Germany we have been better prepared in terms of the pandemic and the obstacles we have to overcome in this pandemic, because we have detected and identified these problems beforehand already in the past, because we know that we can't just, we can cope with these problems in a transversal, in a field, cross-ministry approach. Of course, we can only treat or deal with this or tackle this problem with health policy strategies. No, we need a global, a holistic approach, and we have to join forces and create synergies in order to do so. So from this point of view, I think thanks to our work in the subcommittee, we had the opportunity to deal with different topics and issues, such as neglected diseases, or marginalized groups, or poverty-related illnesses. And we've learned a lot, but nevertheless, I have to say that there is much work to do, and we should not, be overwhelmed by this pandemic. No, not at all. We should see the bigger picture, and what we should do is to accept this global challenge, and not only the current COVID-19 pandemic, but also in terms of HIV, the HIV epidemic, TB epidemic, etc. And I think the coalition agreement, I mean, the community, I guess you wanted more. You wanted your own chapter dealing with global health, or referring to global health within, or anchored within, the coalition contract. But nevertheless, there is a part saying that the One Health approach will strengthen, or on the basis of this One Health approach, the global health structure will be strengthened. I mean, this is a leitmotif, isn't it? I mean, it seems to be a bit fuzzy, maybe, or not paramount enough, but nevertheless, this is a concrete goal, a concrete objective being embedded in the coalition contract or agreement. And I think together with other sentences referring to strengthening civil societies, it is clearly anchored within this agreement. And as you've already said, Ms. Haase, there is a strong reference to human rights. And I think the new government will continue the strategy, or will work based on the strategy regarding One Health that has been issued by the former federal government. And I think Germany, well, in the future, Germany will remain one, or could be one of the champions in global health. So I think during the next legislative period, there will also be a subcommittee on health. Yes, we definitely advocated for that. We will create a bigger, or a more important committee, because this interdisciplinary cooperation is of utmost importance for us. And I think we will know more next week, and whether this worked or not. Thank you very much, Ms. Baehrens. Mr. Zubeil. So regarding the federal Ministry of Health is in charge of One Health and the global health strategy. Ms. Baehrens already talked about it. And I think Germany played a strong role during the last years as a champion in the area of global health. And we've already heard a lot about it, a lot of, nice words, appreciation, etc., also in terms of COVID and the Global Fund. So the health ministry advocated for a better, let's say, to better intertwine the different actors and stakeholders. And when it comes to health structure and the Global Fund and the funding fund Mr. Benn talked about. And yesterday, I think in the context of the World Health Organization, the WHO decided on a global health contract that will be negotiated over the coming 3 years. Now, I think this is something you will deal with in the ministry. So from your point of view regarding this pandemic contract and to further strengthen global cooperation, also in terms of the criteria Sasha Volgina and Dr. Benn talked about, so strengthening, reinforcing, promoting multilateral cooperation and collaboration, strengthening the position of civil societies and communities, etc. What are the most important aspects or, let's say, characteristics of this contract? First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to come back to Ms. Baehrens. I think was really interesting. The coalition agreement or treaty shows that compared to, or when it comes to international policies, it seems to be a bit fuzzy or abstract, but nevertheless, there are a lot of important red guidelines being embedded in this contract. And now I would like to come back to your question. So here in Germany, we deal with a situation where different stakeholders of the health landscape and health architecture are very much fragmented and scattered. And this has become more evident with the pandemic. So how fragmented and scattered this landscape is. And I think it was quite positive, to be honest, because we know the status quo. And there are 3 things that are decisive from our point of view. So first of all, we need to hamper, we need to stop, we need to avoid and prevent further scattered and fragmented landscape. We need new mechanisms and new institutions, but nevertheless, we have to join them. We have to bring them together in order to avoid the fragmentation of the health landscape. And in order to prevent further fragmentation, we need to strengthen sustainably WHO, because there is the group within WHO dealing with global funding and dealing with sustainability and how WHO can be supported and funded in a sustainable way in order to make it possible to facilitate, to support their work so that they can fulfill their normative role. And when it comes to the pandemic, especially we're just in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've said that there will be a pandemic contract and that the member states will sign this contract and will also decide and vote on the international structure of the pandemic or prevention in order to be able to, or better at the pandemic response. So when it comes to the pandemic contract, I think it is decisive, or 3 points of utmost importance. We can only fulfill the contract. It can only be a great success when we strengthen systems and when we make global health systems resilient. So we need to enhance prevention and early detection and early response to pandemics, and the fair access to to funding, etc., is of utmost importance. So I refer to the access to vaccines, to medicine, drugs, etc. And so the pandemic contract relies on One Health. Might I interrupt you? I think it's really difficult to understand you. There is a technical problem with your microphone. I think it is the microphone or your headset. Maybe there are technical problems. Is it better? No, not better at all. Maybe you can speak without your mic. Can you remove your headset, please?
Well, I think you're not loud enough. Actually, the interpreters informed that the connection is really bad, especially in terms of the volume. If not, maybe we hand back to Miss Pickel, and in the meantime, I fix my microphone. Yes, I think that makes sense. Just propose the same thing, that we first talk with Miss Pickel, and then we might come back. Okay, so let's do that, because the connection was really bad, not only for me, but that was difficult for everybody. So thank you so far for checking your technical devices. A bit more about the pandemic's contract, and we come back to the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation. You're very committed with infectious disease, especially with the Global Fund in the area of HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, and you've been over many years active in global health topics, and if I'm right, in terms of cooperation with civil society organizations and actors. So if we try to think about the lessons we've learned about the pandemics we're still living in, we've seen some changes already. There's the sub-departments with 4 sections with 4 departments. Before there was one big department. So actually there is a big focus on the area of global health with the core principle of One Health as the overall principle. So from your point of view, what are the concrete next steps which need to be taken also from the new government also in the next year in order to handle the current pandemics and to get out of this situation? Thank you, Ms. Haase, and thank you for inviting me to this event today on the World AIDS Day. I'm especially happy to represent the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, and I can assure you that we'll play an important role also in the next legislature. And currently, Germany is the 3rd donor in global health, and we as the ministry in 21, we have spent more than 2 billion euros for global health matters, which is higher than which we usually spend. But this highlights how important this is. And in terms of the creation of the new government, actually, we see good connection points with this current document with our commitment in the area of global health. The architecture is one part, One Health, human rights-based approach, and a clear commitment with global reproductive and sexual health, which is the important part of the work of the Global Fund, but also of all our commitment of our ministry in cooperation with the other ministries. So in that sense, we're optimistic when we start next week with our new minister that we will continue our commitment. Specifically to your question now, you know that in the pandemic, Ms. Baehrens already mentioned it, we really have to continue the commitment we've shown already in the accelerator context. Sometimes I hear already, oh, we should look more forward and new funds. And of course, this is an important discussion. But currently, it is very important that acutely in the struggle against this pandemic and the implementation of vaccination facilities, etc., in the countries, this is very important that the jabs which are available really can be used. This is the first priority which new government needs to commit to with the necessary financial support. And we understand that this actually we're the second donor in the Act A, 2.2 billions of euros for 2021, and I'm optimistic that we can keep this level. The money will be needed in any case. Beyond this, I understand it's really necessary, and we see that in the results report of the Global Fund, the results report of the Global Financing Facility, which is taking account other reports. We see an important step backwards in terms of infectious diseases. So the long-term commitment we've been pursuing over many years with our allies and with our bilateral programs, and was already mentioned Ukraine. In many countries, we are still active on a bilateral level, and we have to continue this, maybe even on a higher level, in order to compensate the backlash and to get back to the track to pursue the initial objectives, which with the high-level declaration from last summer have been defined. So current pandemic struggle, and then the vision on the long-term commitment. We have the replenishment topic for next year. We, as the presidency of the G7, we will have an active and complementary role, and we want to keep up at least the level in cooperation with our federal parliament. Maybe one just last word on the debate on the architecture. Christoph Benn was giving a back historical perspective, and in this discussion, some points are important. If we don't use this pandemic, this momentum, which we had already in the past, to have a look where are the gaps in the current prevention and fight against the pandemic, and how can we close these gaps financially, and this needs to be beyond ODA. This is relevant, especially for the lower income countries, and we need supplementary and complementary financing for them. But even beyond this, we have to do more. So financial gaps, but also institutional gaps have to be filled. And there are some areas which are not that well prepared in the area of surveillance, for example. How can we close these gaps? How can we create an inclusive process through the actors who have to implement it afterwards, the communities, the health systems of the countries? How can we handle this in a participatory way? And these are important questions which we should discuss. And whatever we do, existing instruments we already have should be enhanced. There should be no competition between the different organizations, stakeholders. It needs to be complementary. And this direction, we as a federal government, in cooperation with our allies, we want to contribute to this international debate. Thank you, Ms. Pickel. I'd like to ask Christoph Benn and Sasha Volgina again, but just coming back to Mr. Zubeil, who again is called Miss Schmidt now. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, I think it works now. So sorry for this bumpy start. I want to say shortly something on the pandemic contract. From German point of view, the minister is really important for the Ministry of Health, and in the working committee who's defining the details of this contract, this was already discussed. From German point of view, very important is the enhancement of the global and national resilience for future pandemics, but also improve prevention, early detection. This is really necessary, and other speakers already mentioned a more equitable access to therapeutical measures, to vaccinations, a presentation, a point which Ms. Pickel already mentioned. And as a last point, I want to mention the strengthening of the international health architecture with the WHO in the center, with a coordinating role that's very important. And civil society presented that their points which could enter into the contract. There is the One Health approach, and there is the more equitable access to medication and other measures. These contributions of civil society are enormously important and helpful for Germany in order to orient and to steer our behavior in the future measures. And so these points will be included also in this contract. And the civil society, as a last point, maybe had different possibilities in other fora like Global Health in Germany, and they had the possibility to ask what they think what should be important topics for G7, but also the pandemic contract. So we have this scope that we listen quite closely to what civil society tells us, what is important to them, so that we can implement this within our activities. Thank you, Mr. Zubeil. What becomes clearer now is this dilemma on one side, new structures, think of new structures on one side, and create improvements to this. And on the other hand, the situation we are now. We are still currently trapped, the COVID pandemic, but also other health crises, which we should not lose out of sight. Ms. Pickel mentioned that, Ms. Baehrens. So a pandemic contract, probably the negotiations will take 2 years at least. So the question is, what could Germany do additionally in order to really create concrete changes? I would like to involve Sasha Volgina again. Sasha said quite clearly what the role of the communities is and how important it is that the changes really arrive on site and in the country. So what are the concrete expectations towards the German federal government now to make a change? Sasha.
So yeah, well, first of all, I'm really very happy to hear, that the commitment from Germany is still there, and that German government is still thinking about that. It's important, to invest, and indeed, this all negotiations will take time. Meanwhile, I think it's important to support what Global Fund is doing. It's very important to look over the architecture, the treatment access, and identify the gaps. I think Pickel was talking about that, right? About the gaps. We need to look at the gaps where we're losing the opportunities, and we do have them, and try to strategize on what is most effective. What is really important. And of course, I'm also very glad to hear that civil society should be fully at the table. I think that's the key. That's how we will build the trust between medical systems and between the society. Otherwise, we're done, with all the pandemics. I don't think it will work. So I really hope that investment will be kept on the same level. I really hope that that's not the last time we're talking about that. I hope we will have more conversations, going through every stage of the pandemic preparedness and looking like, here's the gap, what we should do with that. And it's really have to be facilitated because the competition, unfortunately, is there. And some measures are seen to be more popular and more funded and more appropriate, let's put it like that. But then we're losing the opportunities which are given by the others ones, which are looked upon as more radical ones, but they can bring us real success. So let's be very careful. Let's not stop these discussions. And the last thing I also wanted to I forgot to say that in my speech, but this is a very important part. And we're focusing our, the whole World AIDS Day today from the side of the GNP Plus, talking about the communities at the table. I think that decriminalization of people is the key thing. We can't, work together with you being criminalized. This is just inappropriate. We're already 40 years in this response. I'm pretty tired. Ferenc knows, we've been in a one delegation. I'm pretty tired of repeating that once and once again. It's not like if you want communities to be part of the resolving the trouble, we need, to be equally at the table. So the decriminalization of HIV and decriminalization of the key populations is also it's essential. And I think that Western countries should support that and push the other countries in the developing world, to change that, because just asking us to come when the crisis is there, using our time and all of our energy and then just throwing us away from the decision making and then keeping criminalizing us, it just doesn't work like that. And I think we have to stop doing business as usual.
Vielen Dank, Sascha. Vielleicht erstmal.
Thank you, Sasha. Maybe shortly to Ms. Pickel, because the Ministry for Economic Cooperation is cooperating strongly with countries with social society and tries to enhance their voice. So is this something which is really on the top of your agenda? And could you maybe tell us a bit where your focus will be? Thank you. Yeah, I think our Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development and the federal government is defending an inclusive approach and defending partnerships with the actors like the Global Fund. The Global Fund is strong because the different stakeholders and actors cooperate there and come to common decisions. I can see that in our German group. I'm a member for Germany in the Global Fund, and we are in constant debate also with the German civil society, and this is really fruitful for our own positioning to better understand what works, what does not work. And I hope I can speak also on behalf of Mr. Wiesner. We're in close contact with him, but this is really enriching for us. So this is just as on general terms. Now, in the context of the policies of the Global Fund, we're really working in favor of that the different actors on site, like technically speaking, in the coordinating structures in the countries where the Global Fund is investing, that they're really involved and they are sufficiently financed. This is very important. And beyond this, we as a ministry, we have a large portfolio which we foster the civil society with. Brot für die Welt, more than 10% of our budget goes directly into funding of NGO organizations. Not all in global health, of course. There are other important sectors like the agriculture, water, education, etc. But a big part is used for health topics. And so after all, it's a very important instrument to work in the direction of more pluralism in the countries where we are active, but also participation. We are trying to strengthen civil society and bring it to the table. So this is a very important point. And I hope that this broad approach and the cooperation between the public funding and non-public funding, will continue this in the next legislative period. In our coalition contract, we mentioned explicitly this part and talk about foundations. The question of decriminalization today is the World AIDS Day, and this is a very important topic, and we all know that it's not only about more money in fighting HIV and AIDS, but also structural changes which need to take place in the countries with legal changes. For example, the reduction of thresholds, recognizing people the way they are, and so we hope actually that in these countries, and this goes a bit into the direction of our allied countries. This is nothing we can really influence directly, but we can work very well with non-governmental partners through funding. So this is prevention, and at the end of the day, this is cheaper than curing.
Very much, Ms. Pickel. So we've received first questions in the Q&A function, and I would like to include them into our discussion because we've heard from Sasha Volgina what your expectations are to or on the German government, like technology transfer, access to drugs or to medicine, to vaccines, etc. This is just at the top of the list, of the things you want to have or that should be supported by the federal government. So in terms of the pandemic treaty or coalition or contract, it is of course of utmost importance to create the access to drugs. Is this a concrete point that should be included? So like the federal government, will they support and fund further development of vaccines and that they will be available at global level? Is that true? Is that the case? Yes, thank you very much for this question. I would like to create a link to what Ms. Pickel said. So Germany plays an important, a prominent role a paramount role in global health, and this became quite obvious when it comes to multilateralism, the multilateral work of WHO and the response to COVID-19, etc. So, and civil society is intensively included in this work. So there are different forums where this takes place. Now, I think Germany definitely needs to continue this work. And like you've already said, of course, I refer to the TRIPS waivers. Germany is committed in this field when it comes to vaccine production, manufacturing, etc. But nevertheless, when Germany always said, okay, what we need is knowledge transfer. This is of utmost importance. So it's not only about, lifting patents, but it's also about sharing the knowledge and the technology, of course, because lifting patents is not enough, of course. So this helps, to Germany should support creating or building up structures for vaccine production in emerging countries and developing countries on the African continent, for example. So there are many things that are about to happen, and Germany definitely seizes its responsibility. So up to end to 2021, there will be 100 million doses, vaccine doses, given by Germany, provided by Germany via COVAX. Then, nevertheless, during the next legislative period or time, there will be support available also after the pandemic. I mean, the next pandemic is just around the corner. So, thank you so much. You talked about Ms. Pickel and referring and talking about technology transfer, and I'm very happy to hear that Germany has provided the 100 million doses. That's new information because I think 100 million doses should have been provided or given by the end of the year. They should be injected into COVAX. So you still have 4 weeks to go, right, to reach this goal. So now, Christoph, I would like to get you into the discussion because we've talked about the role played by civil society, but now I would like to come back to structural changes that are necessary. And what about the competition? So what about the competition in terms of funding? You said that we need new principles for funding for investments so that public goods are available for all countries. So what are the basic criteria you have in mind in order to avoid a competition between the different funds, referring to the Global Fund, thinking about the upcoming year, or in order for upcoming pandemics, technology transfer, production, capacity building, etc. You name it. So thank you so much, Mareike. First of all, I would like to say that it is really interesting that we've reached a consensus here. You know, all the different panelists reached a consensus. And I mean, we should not take that for granted because this shows that Germany will play a leading role and can assume or take over, seize a leading role next year because the representatives of the important ministry, civil society, and the government will collaborate or work together closely. And so I think this is paving the way for Germany becoming a champion or playing an important leadership role, I would say that this way, put it that way, you name it. So I think the strong support of the multilateral system per se is of utmost importance. And you, Ms. Baehrens, you said that this has been anchored or embedded into the coalition treaty or agreement. So it is an important point. And second point, the fragmentation. We should prevent further fragmentation and of the health architecture. And of course, you're absolutely right. I think we can even avoid making it more complicated and less efficient. And we are on the same page, ladies and gentlemen. And the third point, and I think we should underpin this again and again, that this architecture we have that has been established for 20 years, so WHO, other organizations, legitimization, legal questions, together with all the different member states, WHO plays a minor role, but it plays a role. But WHO is not in charge of procurement, etc. So the WHO reaches its limits. So we definitely have to keep that in mind. But WHO has been, let's say, there are add-ons by the Global Fund, Gavi, and the Global Finance Facility, and this is a great combination. And I think this proved itself as an effective measure. And I think Germany contributed to this via the action plan in order to more intertwine the different stakeholders. And I think, of course, it is about closing the gaps, because there are gaps, and the pandemic showed that. It proved that there are gaps. And health systems and the strengthening of health systems is something that is of utmost importance, especially when it comes to German health policy. And I think we can definitely find an important work there. And I would like to come back to technology transfer, but the TRIPS waiver. I mean, the Global Fund is a very interesting example, because the Global Fund, from the beginning on, the patents have been lifted or suspended via the TRIPS waiver mechanism. And I refer only to 1% or less of 1% than in 2020. And I mean, no pharmaceutical company failed. You know, they're still working, they're still operable, they still make money, so no problems at all in this case. So in this area. So regarding the vaccine patents, no company would suffer from a TRIPS waiver during a global health emergency like we have now. So I mean, those doubts regarding, it could hamper our, I don't know, research and so on. No, it's not. This is not the case. So the Global Fund definitely made a big step including the communities and civil society 100%. And this is something very, very positive. And I think this can also be, or this is a good example for also in the midst of the pandemic, because those people being vulnerable to become more prone to poverty, for example, and to lose their livelihoods during the pandemic, etc., they can also benefit from this mechanism. This is why we need new funding mechanisms, and it's not a low threshold, you know. So we need to create this new architecture. We can create something new, but nevertheless, there are high expectations, high obstacles, because we cannot fall back to what we've had in the past regarding the procurement mechanisms. We need to create them. We have to establish them. It will take years to establish and to create procurement mechanisms to procure therapeutics, all drugs, etc., to get all those products to the people who are in urgent need. So we've already done a lot, and I think it has been a great success in the past, but nevertheless, we should not, you know, just say, okay, let's create a new mechanism, no, or a new structure. This should not be the case. It is of utmost importance to think about what should be new, what should be renewed, and to bring everything together and to bring the best together. And the most important point is to reach the people with efficient, effective systems and effective international cooperation and development cooperation. And I think this is what we would like to achieve, isn't it? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have 5 minutes left from our session and discussion. And before I give you the floor for a final 1 minute or half a minute reflection, that's something that you might have left out, I have 2 thoughts. One of them is that we talked a lot about the current struggles, but I think we shouldn't forget the chronic struggles which have been with us. Sasha has mentioned them a lot of times. This is human rights, criminalization, and punitive laws and policies that affect people. And the other thought which I had during our conversation was thinking about that there is competition between pandemics and competition between responses. Well, because we create these competitions, then they will exist. If we make sure that all pandemics are responded properly, there is proper funding for them, then we kill the competition, and then all the pandemics can go through as smoothly as possible. So before we close our session, Sasha, would you like to have a final half a minute sentence?
Yes, thanks a lot, Ferenc, and thanks a lot, everyone, for the discussion. I think that's exactly what, like, you know, like how should look like what we're going to build, and that should respond to both epidemics and to the future, both pandemics and to the future pandemics, and what are the main pillars and rules, how we should put people at the center, which is the recommendation, you know, like, let's take the recommendations from UNAIDS, from Global Fund Strategy, from WHO. We basically do have all the information, what we have to do, right? We know what is working, we know what is working well. We should just create, you know, the mechanism which would be appropriate for all the pandemics. The rules there, they're pretty similar, you know. I don't see such a great difference between the pandemics itself. So it was very fruitful discussion. I'm really grateful to everyone and I'm really happy to hear about the commitment, because we saw already the Western countries who stopped supporting HIV field. So I'm really happy to hear that that's not the case with Germany. Yeah, we're very open to the further discussions and going into the details and seeing what we can achieve together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sasha. Dr. Benn?
Thank you, Ferenc. I think I have said what I wanted to say, so I'm happy to leave the rest of my minute to Heike Baehrens for your final statement. Thank you.
Thank you again for being with us. Frau Baehrens, bitte schön.
Thank you so much. I wanted to say that Dr. Benn created or brought everything together, all the different information, what we need, what are the requirements, etc. So I think everything we have on our hands, we need to put that together. We need to pool all that. You know, it's not about creating new structures, establishing new mechanisms. It's about using what we have. And I think the upcoming 6 months, they will be decisive for our success, whether we will be able to adapt the global health governance architecture properly or not, or whether we will perpetuate it or adapt it or, you know, weaken it maybe. So in order to do so for this global health architecture with a strong mechanism, we need a sustainably financed and strongly financed WHO. And I think our guidelines for further development should be the 17 SDGs. They should be our basis, our pillars, because the pooling and bringing together all those different SDGs is of utmost importance, not only in order to enhance pandemic preparedness and response. And I think Germany, in the context of its presidency, G7 presidency, it will play its part, so to speak, or a role. And I think we're on a good way, I would say. We are on track.
Thank you so much. I agree. Next one, Frau Pickel. A short comment.
Ja, ganz kurz, das wurde schon gesagt.
I think most of the information has already been provided. I really liked and enjoyed this discussion, as I think Germany starts from a good basis as champion of global health, like several people already said. But I think we need to lever this momentum of the pandemic in order to perpetuate and to use what we've already had, and we have to strengthen further cooperation and the mechanisms. And of course, we already have everything on our hands, what we need. We have the Global Action Plan, and with Ghana and Norway and Germany, well, issued by them. And we have Act A as platform for coordination and good cooperation. And I think this is a good basis. We should assess these platforms and integrate them into this international discussion to create a long-term pandemic preparedness and to mobilize everything we need for the future.
Thank you so much. And then last but not least, yes, Herr Zubeil, final short comment, please.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pickel and Ms. Baehrens. I think you've already said everything, but nevertheless, I would say the following. It is all about reducing inefficiencies of already existing structures and to learn from the pandemic, to learn our lessons and to use them in order to be better, to act better in the future. So we need sustainable planification, sustainable funding. We need to create sustainability. So we have the HERA in Brussels. We have already existing structures. We don't need new ones. We need to bring them together, to join forces, to create synergies between the already existing structures and to learn our lessons from this pandemic. This is what we have to do. And I think Germany will play its part and will play a central role and will keep on working and further pushing this agenda. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for these final words. I think this is very crucial, that we must learn from the previous pandemics and bring these lessons forward to the future. Our session is over. I would just like to very quickly again, thanks so much for our wonderful speakers, our panels, discussions, and also Mareike, my co-facilitator, for the wonderful facilitating of the panel, and also Jeff, who has been taking notes and going to write a fantastic paper. The next session is going to start in 7 minutes. Sorry for shortening the break, but I think the discussion was very rich. And then there will be some discussions looking at arguments for investing into these pandemics. So stay tuned for the next session starting at 1:45. Thank you again. Bye-bye and stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.